The studio was electric that night, buzzing with anticipation. Elon Musk had just taken his seat across from Jimmy Kimmel, the applause still echoing through the room. What was meant to be a conversation about innovation and humanitarian tech quickly shifted into unfamiliar territory. At first, Jimmy appeared playful, throwing out the usual jabs he was known for, but there was something sharper beneath the laughter, a tone that didn't quite match the occasion. The crowd chuckled as Jimmy pressed Elon about his public persona, mocking the way he tweeted late into the night or posted cryptic messages online. Elon smiled politely, brushing it off with an air of indifference. But then Jimmy leaned forward, his tone darker, more deliberate, and with a smirk that didn't fade, he brought up Elon's parenting. He questioned whether Elon's children even knew who he was, suggesting he spent more time building rockets than raising his own family. The audience gasped, a silence slicing through the air like a blade. Elon froze, eyes locked on Jimmy, and for a brief moment, the air between them thickened. The tension was no longer performative, it was real, raw, and unsettling. Elon's face didn't change much, but something had shifted. The playfulness in his demeanor disappeared entirely. He straightened in his seat, arms folding tightly across his chest. Jimmy, sensing that he may have crossed a line, attempted to pivot, offering a half-hearted laugh to cover the moment. But the damage had already been done. Instead of brushing it off, Elon turned toward the audience. He calmly laid out the sacrifices he had made, not just for his businesses, but for the very future of humanity. He spoke about raising children, in a world that was changing too quickly, about being a present father even when the world demanded everything of him. It was personal, piercing, and completely unrehearsed. But Jimmy wasn't ready to let go of the reins. Perhaps trying to reclaim control of the show, he made another offhand remark, this time questioning Elon's ability to relate to ordinary people, mocking the idea that someone who lived among private jets and billion-dollar deals could ever understand real struggle. Elon's gaze sharpened. What had started as entertainment was quickly descending into something volatile. The studio audience, now on edge, didn't know whether to laugh or hold their breath. Elon slowly leaned forward, looking Jimmy directly in the eye. And then he responded. Not with a quip, not with anger, but with a cold, precise dismantling of every point Jimmy had made. He challenged the notion that wealth erased empathy. He reminded Jimmy of the time he spent on the ground with engineers, building from scratch, sleeping in factories, staying up for days not because it was comfortable, but because he believed in something bigger than himself. He painted Jimmy's remarks as lazy, shallow, and worst of all, cowardly. The crowd murmured as Elon pushed back harder than anyone had anticipated. Jimmy, now visibly flustered, attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but Elon refused. The balance of power on stage had tilted, and everyone in the room could feel it. What was supposed to be another light-hearted late-night interview had become something else entirely. Elon wasn't just defending himself, he was exposing the cracks in Jimmy's carefully curated charm. The confrontation had begun, and neither of them was backing down. The silence that followed Elon's bold response was heavy. Even the cameras seemed unsure whether to cut to commercial or capture the unraveling that was unfolding on live television. Jimmy Kimmel, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat, gripping the cue cards in his hands like they might anchor him. But the weight of Elon's words had landed, and there was no brushing them off. Rather than returning to a place of levity, Jimmy doubled down. He scoffed at Elon's response, accusing him of playing the victim, suggesting that his wealth had insulated him from criticism for too long. The tone grew mocking again, and he called Elon out for being overly sensitive, painting him as a man who could build rockets to Mars but couldn't take a joke. Elon's stare never wavered. The calm that had defined his earlier rebuttal was gone now. In its place was a sharp, calculated fury. He leaned forward again, his voice low but cutting, and began pointing out the hypocrisy in Jimmy's platform. He brought up moments when the host had punched down under the guise of comedy, making light of vulnerable groups, political turmoil, and personal tragedies. Elon referenced specific monologues, resurfacing clips the audience barely remembered, and laid them bare without flinching. Jimmy's jaw tightened. This was no longer an interview. It had become an audit. The audience, once laughing and cheering, now sat in uneasy silence. They were witnessing something far beyond entertainment, a dissection of persona, ego, and moral high ground. Elon reminded everyone that he didn't come from generational wealth, that he had faced rejection, ridicule, and failure long before he became a household name. He explained that while comedy was meant to challenge power, Jimmy had become a gatekeeper who used mockery to protect the status quo. Jimmy tried to laugh it off again, but the tension had changed. Elon wasn't there to entertain or play along with scripted back and forths. He was there to make a point, and he was doing it with surgical precision. Then Elon turned the conversation toward a deeper critique. He pointed out how late-night television had become less about humor and more about posturing. He accused Jimmy of exploiting personal attacks for ratings, masking cruelty as satire. He questioned how someone with a platform that reached millions could be so careless with his words, knowing the impact they had beyond the studio walls. For a brief moment, Jimmy seemed stunned. He wasn't used to being confronted this way, not by a guest, and certainly not by someone who had just been insulted on his show. The control he usually wielded so effortlessly had slipped, and Elon had taken it without raising his voice. The audience began to shift. Some looked toward Jimmy, waiting for him to regain control, but others, many others, were now locked in on Elon. Not because he was famous, not because he was powerful, but because he had refused to play by the rules. He wasn't smiling, wasn't pandering. He was standing up for something real, and people could feel it. Then Jimmy made his mistake. He raised his voice. He accused Elon of being out of touch, of losing his soul to success. He claimed that the very things Elon was preaching about, authenticity, empathy, struggle, were manufactured, part of a polished image crafted to manipulate public opinion. It was a harsh move, desperate and cruel, and it backfired instantly. Elon didn't flinch. He responded by looking directly at the audience and speaking about the night he had slept in his Tesla factory, on a cold floor beside exhausted workers, because he didn't want to ask anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. He described how his own children had called him out for missing birthdays, and how those moments haunted him more than any business failure ever could. The room went quiet again. Not because Elon had shouted, but because what he had said cut through the noise with brutal honesty. It wasn't a defense. It was the truth, unfiltered and laid bare under the studio lights. Jimmy looked at his producers, eyes darting toward the control booth, but no one knew how to intervene. The show was off script, and Elon had taken command of the stage. The producers behind the glass were frozen, headsets buzzing with whispered chaos as the show veered wildly off course. They had prepped for controversy, not war. On stage, Jimmy Kimmel sat stiff, face tight with frustration, as Elon Musk's unflinching gaze never left him. The studio air had turned bitter. The crowd remained pinned in silence, caught between disbelief and anticipation, unsure if they were witnessing brilliance or destruction. Jimmy leaned in again, this time discarding any pretense of charm. He accused Elon of exploiting his hardships, to shield himself from criticism, framing his story as a carefully rehearsed sob narrative designed to evoke sympathy. He mocked Elon's emotional moment about his children, saying that every parent missed birthdays, that guilt didn't make a man noble. It made him just like everyone else. But Elon didn't bite. He didn't try to outshout Jimmy or beg for empathy. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and took a slow breath, letting the tension steep. He then turned the tables completely, not with another defense, but with a question, one that cut deeper than anything Jimmy had said that night. He asked Jimmy what he had sacrificed. It wasn't rhetorical. Elon wanted an answer. What had Jimmy ever given up to stand for something? Had he ever risked his reputation, his fortune, his relationships? Or had he simply made a career from hiding behind a desk, behind cue cards, behind applause? The words weren't loud, but they landed with seismic force. Jimmy bristled. He fired back, lashing out with venom. He ridiculed Elon's ventures, calling them ego-driven fantasies. He accused Elon of seeking attention more than progress, claiming that behind every mission was a thirst for legacy, not a love for humanity. His voice cracked with anger, the mask of cool confidence completely shattered. Elon remained still, like the eye of a storm. Then, for the first time that night, his voice rose. Not in anger, but in sheer force. He listed the lives changed by his projects, the innovations that had saved cities from blackouts, the engineers he had mentored, the children inspired by space exploration. He wasn't asking for praise. He was reminding everyone why he was, even in that chair. And then he turned to the audience again, not the one in the studio, but the one watching at home. He spoke about the danger of letting entertainers become gatekeepers of truth. He called out the culture of mockery that paraded as wit, where empathy was seen as weakness, and real conviction was flattened into punchlines. His voice carried weight, and for a moment, the stage felt less like a studio and more like a reckoning. Jimmy stood up, no cue, no script, just raw impulse. He stared down at Elon, trying to regain the upper hand, trying to make a statement. But the anger in his posture revealed how deeply he had been rattled, and Elon, still seated, looked up at him with an expression that wasn't fearful or amused. It was pitiful. The crowd shifted again. Some gasped, others murmured. This wasn't comedy. This was a collapse. A host brought to his feet not by triumph, but by insecurity. A guest sitting in defiance, not as a billionaire, but as a man who refused to be humiliated. Jimmy's words stumbled. His insults began to lose their sting, sounding more like desperation than dominance. The more he talked, the more apparent it became that the audience wasn't with him anymore. He was no longer the conductor of laughs, but the object of growing discomfort. Then Elon stood, but not to match Jimmy's aggression. He stood with calm certainty, stepping into the spotlight not to shout, but to end it. He didn't address Jimmy. He looked past him, into the lens, as if speaking directly to the millions watching from home. His message was simple. Never let mockery be louder than meaning. Never let ego silence impact. He turned to walk off the stage. Jimmy, momentarily speechless, reached for one last jab, something to save face. But before he could speak, Elon stopped, turned his head slightly and said something the mics barely picked up, but the silence that followed said it all. It was over. Elon Musk had just exited the stage, his silence echoing louder than any insult that could have been hurled. The studio lights dimmed slightly, almost unsure of their cue. Jimmy Kimmel remained standing, staring at the space where Elon had been. Just seconds before, his chest rising and falling with the residue of a confrontation he no longer had the strength to carry. For a few agonizing seconds, Jimmy said nothing. Then, with a twitch of the lips meant to resemble a smirk, he tried to laugh it off. He mumbled something dismissive, something about egos and billionaires and thin skin, hoping the audience would offer the relief of applause. But it didn't. Come. The crowd, once comfortably aligned with Jimmy's sarcasm, was still reeling from what they'd just witnessed. The vibe had shifted, and everyone knew it. It wasn't that Elon had been flawless. He had been vulnerable, exposed, and at times biting. But that was what had made it powerful. In contrast, Jimmy now looked petty. The more he joked, the more obvious it became he wasn't joking at all. His laughter no longer felt like levity. It sounded like a man drowning. Desperate to regain control, Jimmy pivoted, trying to shift the audience's focus to the next segment. He introduced a musical guest no one was in the mood to hear. He read from the teleprompter with forced enthusiasm, pretending the last 20 minutes hadn't unfolded like a live demolition of his authority. But the control room was in chaos. Producers scrambled, cutting to commercial breaks too early, playing the wrong camera feeds. Online, clips of the exchange were already going viral. Social media flooded with quotes, reactions, and frame-by-frame dissections. The narrative was slipping away, and Jimmy could feel it. After the show wrapped, the aftermath began. Outside the studio, journalists waited, hoping to catch a glimpse of Elon or grab a statement. But Elon didn't linger. He had made his point, and moved on. Meanwhile, inside, Jimmy was being pulled into an impromptu meeting with his producers. No one was yelling yet, but the tension was thicker than it had been on stage. The backlash wasn't about one rude comment. It was about how easily it all fell apart. About how quickly Jimmy went from confident host to a man cornered by his own smugness. Viewers weren't praising his wit. They were questioning his integrity. The audience that once hung on his every punchline had watched him get punched back, and they liked it more than he expected. Meanwhile, Elon released a short statement. Online, not directed at Jimmy, but at viewers. He thanked those who understood the importance of meaningful dialogue, and he reaffirmed his belief that platforms, whether televised or digital, should uplift ideas, not humiliate individuals. For sport, it wasn't defensive. It was composed, and it landed like a final nail. Even some of Jimmy's peers began to weigh in. Other hosts, journalists, and celebrities began commenting on the moment. Not all defending Elon, but many acknowledging how far Jimmy had pushed and how gracefully Elon had pushed back. Some even went as far as to say it was the most uncomfortable yet most needed moment in late-night television in years. Internally, executives at the network held tense meetings about damage control. Apologies were drafted, then scrapped. There was talk of inviting Elon back to mend things, but no one thought he'd accept. He had no reason to. He had walked into a hostile space, stood his ground, and walked out having won not with insults, but with conviction. Jimmy, meanwhile, faced a mirror he wasn't ready for. For the first time he saw what it looked like when someone refused to bow to the rules of comedy at someone else's expense. He had built his career on those rules. Now, in real time, they were unraveling. 3 days had passed since the live meltdown between Elon Musk and Jimmy Kimmel, but the world hadn't moved on. If anything, the tension had only grown. Clips of the interview dominated every social feed, replayed endlessly with different angles and headlines. News outlets debated who had crossed the line, but the majority of public opinion was beginning to settle. Jimmy had gone too far, and Elon had walked away stronger. Then came the final blow. Elon had remained mostly quiet, declining interviews, and brushing off requests for comment. But late one evening, without warning or fanfare, he released a pre-recorded message on a major news platform. It wasn't flashy, didn't feature fancy backdrops or dramatic music. It was just Elon, seated at a desk, speaking plainly. He did not mention Jimmy by name. Instead, he spoke about accountability, about the importance of discourse, and about the thin line between comedy and cruelty. He acknowledged his own flaws, his own missteps over the years, but made it clear that what happened on that stage was not about a bruised ego. It was about standing firm in the face of public mockery and refusing to let someone weaponize laughter to dehumanize others. He spoke about dignity. The video exploded. Within hours, it had racked up millions of views, with people praising Elon, not just as a tech giant, but as someone willing to confront humiliation without sinking to its level. It wasn't that he had destroyed Jimmy with words. It was that he had dismantled the game Jimmy played, a game where only the host was allowed to laugh last. Meanwhile, Jimmy had finally gone silent. His show, once a bastion of self-assured satire, opened that week with a noticeably subdued tone. He addressed the audience with forced humility, issuing what many called a non-apology. He said the moment had gotten away from him, that things had gotten too serious, but he stopped short of expressing regret. It wasn't enough. The audience knew it, and so did the network. Ratings dropped. Sponsors began to ask questions. Quietly, behind closed doors, changes were discussed. Not just in programming, but in tone. The world had shifted, and viewers no longer found joy in watching someone tear down a guest who showed up in good faith. For Elon, the aftermath was different. He didn't gloat. He didn't capitalize. He simply continued with his projects, letting his actions speak louder than the moment ever could. But wherever he went, people brought it up. That night, that interview, the moment when the power flipped, and stayed flipped. It became more than a viral event. It became a cultural checkpoint, a reminder that even those who sit behind a desk, armed with a studio and a live audience, can be challenged by someone who refuses to play along. Elon hadn't won because he was louder, or richer, or smarter. He had won because he stayed true to himself when every instinct told him to strike back harder. And for Jimmy, the legacy of that night would never leave him. It became the interview that haunted his reputation, not because Elon Musk destroyed him, but because when the stage became real, Jimmy was the one who blinked. The audience had made its decision, and in the end, it was not laughter that won. It was restraint, truth, and quiet strength.